Adrin crouched at the edge of the jungle. The rocky beach of Fallow Bay stretched out before him. An odd silhouette along the shoreline caught Adrin's eye. A flash of lightning revealed it to be a ship caught on the rocks. What was a ship doing in Fallow Bay? There was nothing out here besides the endless reaches of the thickle, a jungle so treacherous that Adrin had to watch his every step. Adrin had come through the area earlier in the day and hadn't seen anything unusual. The ship probably just arrived. The crew must have been looking for a safe harbor to wait out the storm. Instead, they found the rocky waters of Fallow Bay. They had probably abandoned ship, thinking it was fortunate that they had reached land. Wandering the thickle was no safer than a sinking ship. Death had a million faces in the jungle, especially in a storm, where there was no way of knowing what lurked in the darkness. Adrin didn't want to stay out in the storm any longer, but he was a warden. It was his job to protect people from the dangers of the jungle. These were obviously not his people, but if he didn't help them, they were doomed. So as he rounded the tip of the bay rather than heading east towards Vindri, he tightened the drawstring on his fur cloak and followed the coastline north to the shipwreck. Ganji, his loyal companion, paused and gave a disappointed whine, then hurried to catch up. Ganji was a Krayor, the largest breed of wolf. At the shoulders, he stood a couple of inches shorter than Adrin. Krayors were beautiful creatures, sleek and noble with large, expressive eyes. Like a human, a Krayor's mood was often written on its face. The ship was close to the shore, caught between two spires of jagged stone. They climbed over the rock, choosing their footing carefully on the uneven ground. A ledge placed them right above the deck. They hopped down. Through the darkness and downpour, a patch of reeds seemed to be growing out of the deck. Lightning lanced across the water, revealing the reeds to actually be thousands of arrows stuck in everything. The arrows were pinning down dozens of dead bodies. A blank moment went by as his eyes picked out shadows and edges in the darkness. Recovering night vision, the lightning had momentarily robbed him of. This ship had been through one hell of a battle. Siege bolts were embedded in the hull. The mast had snapped off. The rear cabin had been blasted to pieces. It was so demolished that the stern of the ship was coming apart at the seams. How could the ship have stayed afloat with so much damage? Could anyone have survived all this? Adrin walked toward the deck, examining the bodies. There were two groups among the dead, soldiers and sailors. None of the soldiers had been killed by arrows. They must have boarded the ship after the bombardment had stopped. They had been killed by bladed weapons, like the ones the sailors were carrying. This left little doubt that the armored soldiers had attacked the ship. The sailors were its crew. No one was alive on deck. Adrin took the stairs down to the second level. It was pitch black down here, so he lit a torch. As the light extended out into the darkness, it revealed a similar scene below. The hallway was littered with bodies. A tightly packed battle had left cuts all over the walls. Curiously, the rooms to either side were thrashed but not looted. Every drawer had been emptied on the floor. A few silver coins caught Adrin's eye. They were sitting in plain sight, with a pile of other things. Scrolls, exotic knives, bags of tobacco, bottles of ale. No point in leaving silver behind. He walked into the room and started picking up the pieces, shoving them into the pouch at his side. A pool of thick blood covered the far end of the room. In the dim light, Adrin could just make out a stout figure tied up against the wall. Creeping closer, he realized that it was an old man with dark skin. No, his skin wasn't dark. Every inch of his body was covered in dried blood. From the ends of his fingers to the very tips of his toes, he was covered in hundreds upon hundreds of long, shallow cuts. He had been tortured to death. Adrin was a hard man who had seen many difficult things in his travels, like trembling friends dying slowly from the nastiest poisons of the thickle. But the hardened warden still cringed at this sight. Every single wound had spilled blood, meaning the victim had been alive for every cut. It must have taken hours. Adrian could almost hear him screaming, begging for the pain to stop. Turning away from the ghastly sight, Adrian had to ask why. Torture was always used for a reason, usually to obtain something. He was the oldest person Adrian had seen so far. Perhaps he was the captain or first mate. Adrian walked out into the hall. The torchlight revealed another sickening sight. The end of the hallway was flooded and filled with a pile of bodies. The water's surface was glossy red. The crew had made their final stand here, before a great steel door bordered by steel walls. It was a strong room built into the center of the ship. Whatever the soldiers were after must be behind this door, because it was utterly mangled. Every inch of steel was covered in thousands of crisscrossing cuts where the soldiers had hacked with their blades. When that had failed, they had taken mauls to it. Countless blows had left wide dents, warping the door so extensively that the frame had begun to buckle inward as well. Despite the extensive beating, the door hadn't been breached. It was locked with 3 deadbolts, one at the top, one in the middle, and one at the bottom. They were bent over sideways. The top bolt wasn't even touching the frame. Adrian stepped over the bodies. Ignoring their vacant stares and stiff limbs, the water was greasy against his skin and grew deeper with every step. Ganji waded in as well, his ears cupped toward the door, tail wagging. He barked, informing Adrian that he could hear something on the other side. That made sense. Before the battle, the women and children must have taken refuge in the safest part of the ship. But why hadn't they come out? Did they think the battle was still going on? Did they understand the dangers of running around in the thickle? Maybe they were trapped. The damage to the door could have jammed it shut. Adrian held his ear up against the crack of the door, but he couldn't hear anyone inside. "Is anyone in there?" He held his ear up against the crack again, but still couldn't hear anything through the thick steel and the ruckus of the storm. "I'm going to get you out of there!" Adrian lit another torch and stuck them both in lampstands on the wall. He felt around the water until he found the handle of one of the sledgehammers. It was so heavy that it took Adrian a few moments to heave it up onto his shoulder. He immediately realized why the soldiers had had so much trouble with the door. The hall was narrow and the ceiling was low. There wasn't enough room to take a good swing. Adrian cocked the hammer back and slammed it into the door. The sharp ring of steel against steel echoed through the empty ship. It barely made a dent. He would never get it open this way. Digging into the pouch at his side, Adrian pulled out a small wooden case sealed with wax. He popped it open and carefully drew out an exploding tip. The arrowhead had metal tabs sticking out either side. It was filled with 2 volatile concoctions. When the tip pierced something, the tabs on the sides were pressed flat, mixing the 2 substances. Adrian hated exploding tips. More than one warden has lost his life to a tip going off unexpectedly. Adrian always carried one, though. It was the only way to deal with the largest predators in a thickle. "Stand back from the door!" He screwed the tip onto the shaft and shoved it down into the door's crack. Leaping back, Adrian covered his ears and turned away. The whole ship shuddered. A surge of water passed over him. Now he could clearly hear the cry of a baby.